Turn your camera off. And again, please mute yourself so that we don't have that distraction. All right. Well, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Allison Sheridan. I'm curator of the Farmhouse Museum, and tonight's program is Religious Pluralism at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Got to make that clear. Our presenter tonight is Sarah Dees, and she's an assistant professor of American and Indigenous Religions at Iowa State University here in Ames. She is the editor of Material Religions, the Journal of Objects, Art, and Belief. Much of her work focuses on the history of the study, representation, and governance of Native American and Indigenous religions. This event is part of the exhibition currently at the Farmhouse Museum on campus that explores Victorian-era World's Fairs and includes many objects and connections to tonight's featured fair, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. The exhibition runs through the end of October. And I don't know if Sarah knows this, but her class visit to the Farmhouse Museum several years ago was the impetus for actually creating this exhibition. And so kudos to her for bringing her class and forcing me to research and discuss. It really has been an enjoyable run for this exhibition. And this is just, there's a few more programs left, but again, her class and their interest and their excitement was the catalyst for having the exhibition here. Tonight's program is graciously funded by Carol Pletcher. At the end of the program, we'll post in the comments a quick survey and look forward to hearing back from your feedback. Again, thank you for joining us. It is being recorded, and please mute yourself. Now, please welcome Sarah.
Thanks so much, Allison. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'd like to begin by thanking Iowa State University Museums for offering to host me, and thanks to all of you for joining. So I didn't realize that my class visit had been something that had gotten this exhibition started. So that's really neat to hear. So the topic of this evening's presentation is something that I discuss in my classes. So I've talked with my religion and museums course about this topic, and this is kind of my first stab at creating more of a lecture format for this material. So you all are kind of my guinea pigs. Thanks for being here. But I was glad to have the opportunity to gather my thoughts and excited to share some history with you all this evening. So I just want to start off with a little historical anecdote here. I would like you to imagine yourself here. And this is the Art Institute of Chicago, but it was initially constructed as a building that was going to house the congresses, these gatherings that were going to take place in this World's Fair, 1893, in Chicago. So there are huge throngs of people. It's September. This World's Parliament of Religion is about to get started. And there's huge crowds outside this building trying to make their way in. Everybody is so excited. There are actually police that are called in to help deal with the crowd. So there's concerns that people are going to be trampled, that somebody's going to be injured, because so many people want to get in to this introductory reception for the World's Parliament of Religions. There are newspaper accounts of this occurrence that basically said that there are ladies in evening gowns who can't get in, and there are foreign dignitaries, and they're dressed in their finest, who are trying to be, who are actually being welcomed. So they're supposed to be in this reception. They can't even make it in because there are so many people who want to attend. There's so much interest in this event. I was thinking it would be great if there was, throngs of people outside my intro to religious studies courses of people trying to get in and so excited. But this was really a major event, the first of its kind. The World's Parliament of Religion was the first kind of large interfaith international gathering of leaders and thinkers who came together to talk about their religious beliefs and practices. I would also love to see students in evening gowns in my classes, so that's something maybe I'll consider suggesting at some point. But I'm going to back up just a little bit. So at Iowa State, I teach courses on American religions and then Native American religions. I teach a religion and museum course, which visited the Farmhouse Museum a couple of years ago, and does visits in all of Iowa State University museums. So that's why I'm here today. One of my primary interests is the history of American museum anthropology as it relates to the study and representation of Native American religions. So I'm interested in looking at the ways that scholars in the past collected information about Native American religions and how they wrote about them in scholarly texts and in writings for the general public. I'm also interested in how Native American religions have been represented in museum settings. So, one of the primary organizations that I focus on is part of the Smithsonian Institution. It's called the Bureau of American Ethnology. And it was an institution that was, excuse me, an office that was founded in 1879. So, this is a government funded institution that is collecting a lot of information on Native American religions. And it is important for the American, kind of the foundation of American anthropology. So that's the organization that I primarily look at. And they do play a role in the Chicago World's Fair. The primary era that I'm focused on generally in my research is from roughly 1870 to 1910. So this in American history is known as the Gilded Age or the Progressive Era. But in Native American history, it's often known as the Assimilation Era. And this is because at this point in time, the US government is really actively trying to assimilate Native peoples to kind of mainstream American citizenship. So it's a point in time in which there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of change, there are a lot of new advances in science and in thought and literature in all of these different areas. But there is a lot of concern about Native cultures. And in fact, the US government is really trying to eliminate Native American cultures. So this is kind of the question and the tension that I explore in my work, the ways that there are people trying to gather information about Native cultures during the same era that the government is seeking really to eliminate them. So some of you may be wondering at this point, what's the connection to World's Fairs? Well, actually, there are a lot of connections. There's a lot of connections between World's Fairs and the development of the discipline of anthropology. Anthropology is important because it kind of helped with the development of the academic study of religion. So this is all happening in the same period. And World's Fairs were also really important for the development of museum practices. So if you think about the fairs, in many ways they were exhibitions. So in these spaces, there were objects and cultures and traditions, and even people were put on display in these World's Fairs. So in a lot of ways, some of the function of a World Fair was really to act as a museum, as an exhibition. But then also, eventually World's Fairs ended. They only occurred for, a given amount of time. But in a number of cases, at the conclusion of the fair, that whatever fair it was helped to really get some sort of important museum off the ground. So that could have been through a lot of collecting that was done for the World's Fair was then transferred over to a museum later at the conclusion of the fair. In some cases, if there was any money made with the World's Fair through admission prices, in some cases that money was used then for the foundation of a museum at the conclusion of the fair. So there are a lot of connections between museums and World's Fairs. So I'm just, talking at the beginning here about World's Fairs in general. So we understand their significance for the development of public history, public humanities, museums. But also I really want to highlight the significance of World's Fairs for these academic disciplines, for religious studies, for anthropology. So I'll talk a little bit about fairs kind of generally, and then I'll talk about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, or the World's Columbian Exposition. So it's kind of known by a few names. It's also called the White City. So it's known by a number of names. But then I want to focus on, in particular, on one specific gathering, the World's Parliament of Religions. So this is really is a renowned event. A lot of scholars of religion think about it as the origin of the academic study of religion or the starting point for interfaith movements. It's really, been considered a monumental event, and in many ways it is. It's the first time when religious leaders from around the world come together to gather and have conversations about religion in a public space. So we'll think about its purpose. We'll think about the ways that it's showcasing really a diverse group of religious practitioners and leaders, and then we'll consider the extent to which it lives up to its goals. So a bit about World's Fairs just in general. And let's use the Crystal Palace as an example to start off here. So World's Fairs is the term that is often used in the United States, but they're known by other terms around the world. So they were also described as universal exhibitions or international expositions. And in the second half of the 19th century, these fairs were really important in international exchange. And there's a few origin points we can kind of trace World's Fairs to. So some scholars have traced them back to trade fairs in the Middle Ages. Um, the most important kind of early international World's Fair is usually identified as the London Exposition of 1851, but there were some earlier kind of national manufacturing or trade exhibitions that happened prior to that. So in terms of like a major national industrial manufacturing expo, the first one that a lot of times people identify is one that was held in Prague in 1791. So there's a really long history for these types of gatherings. But the Crystal Palace, this expo in London, is a really important moment, and it's often described as this first official world exposition. So it was held in 1851, which is during the reign of Queen Victoria, and it was an enormously popular event. So all the key leaders and thinkers you could imagine, certainly from the United Kingdom and elsewhere, attended this event. And in terms of numbers, up to 20% of the population of England visited this exhibition. Prince Albert played a really important role in promoting it, and it was held in Hyde Park in this one single, really marvelous purpose-built structure known as the Crystal Palace that we can see here. It had been designed by an architect that had experience in greenhouse design, perhaps unsurprisingly, and proceeds from this exhibit funded the creation of three really important museums in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, or V&A, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum. So how did they get started? What was the purpose of these fairs? And there's a lot of different reasons. For countries that are hosting them, they are a way for them to really showcase their own, goods, products, services, power. They're also meant to kind of educate and uplift the public. It's a way that nations are able to really create and project their national identities. Really at the heart of them, though, was this idea of kind of a commercial enterprise. So there was a lot of motivation coming from industry that helped to really get these off the ground. They were also the sites of international congresses. So these are like gatherings, kind of like conferences, intellectual gatherings focused on particular issues like the World's Parliament of Religion. So there's a scholar, John Burris, that I assigned to my students in my classes, and he really highlights four main elements of these World's Fairs that I also want to underscore here. The ways that these fairs really played a role in the development of the academic study of religion. So, like I was just saying, first, these fairs are commercial enterprises. So they're based on the trade fairs, and they're really out to promote consumption. Something that was significant was they were really available to really the widespread public. And so there were, of course, really expensive tickets you could get to go and enter the Crystal Palace, for example. But they also had very cheap tickets that folks could, working class folks could afford to visit and really be exposed to all of these goods, products, culture that was just unprecedented at the time. But they also encouraged consumption. So there's a lot of souvenirs that you could get. You could buy things to take home with you. And that's one of the categories of objects that we have here at the Iowa State University Museums. We have some souvenirs from a variety of World's Fairs. So they're commercial and they're also a spectacle. They're also meant to be interesting and fascinating and weird and to catch people's attention. So countries and organizations, businesses, whoever is participating in these fairs displayed their finest goods. So they wanted to draw attention to themselves and really, showcase whatever they made to the public. So it's a way of really thinking about bringing together some sort of economic goal also with entertainment. So kind of transforming commerce into something of a spectacle. So people are interested in, all sorts of, were fascinated by all sorts of things that they could see. There were also displays of power at these exhibits, at these expos, like technology, military, political, and cultural forms of power. But they're entertaining, they're exciting. If you think about the term edutainment, there's this idea that you could go and really see a lot of interesting things at these expositions. And of course, another really important element that's very much the case of the Crystal Palace Expo and then the later Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And they're international and they're intercultural. And really, this is the first time for somebody visiting one of these fairs, this is the first time that they would have a really exposure to really a wide array of cultures that they may never have experienced before. There are a lot of international visitors that came to these events, and they made, like I said, they made culture available to people from the country in an unprecedented way. So this is in many ways similar to museums that people can visit nowadays. So there's all the materiality there. There's all the objects and things that you can buy, but they also created opportunities for people to have intellectual exchange and discussion. And so there were a number of congresses or parliaments, conferences that brought together thinkers, leaders, scientists, writers, talking and thinking about a wide range of topics from societal issues to things like finance, education, medicine. So they really created this forum, this space for folks to come together and just, talk with one another about these events. So they brought a lot of people together. There are a few other things that I want to note about these expositions. So first, it's important to note that a lot of the ones that, I guess the ones that I'm focusing on today are occurring in the midst of eras of colonial contact. So this was an era in which a lot of European nations had colonies throughout the world. They're exploiting for objects, for resources, and in some ways, this becomes a place for these colonial nations to really display the spoils of their colonial incursions. So we see that with goods, with resources, and also with peoples that they're colonizing. So that is something that is coming into play in these exhibits. And one of the things that I think about a lot are forms of cultural evolution and scientific racism that are occurring at this point in time. So theories of culture that people had during this era, kind of mid to late 19th century, early 20th century, there's this understanding that there is this form of cultural evolution, and there are technical terms that people use at the time included as savagery, barbarism, and civilization. So this was just understood to be, scientific fact that all cultures progressed through these levels. And of course, the highest forms of culture are forms of civilization. And so in a lot of ways, these expositions wanted to try to illustrate that to, everybody that was there, to the mainstream public. So this sort of idea was prominent at these events, as we'll see. And I think it's helpful to think about these fairs as both performative and productive. So in some ways, they're temporary, they're kind of fake. So the Chicago World's Fair is something that I mean, most of the buildings are meant to be temporary. They look very grand, but it's basically just like plaster that's been spray painted white. And so some people kind of critique the architecture and other aspects of the designs of the gardens as really not reflecting reality at all. So in some ways, they're an opportunity for people to just kind of create a scene, whether or not it actually reflects, reality, whether or not it's actually permanent. But at the same time, they were events that shaped people's ideas. So they were an opportunity for nations, for religions, for all of the communities that are involved to really shape their identity, to project their identity to others. So there was knowledge that was produced at these fairs. People learned things about the world from going to these fairs. So even though they were ephemeral, even though they didn't last, things were temporary, and sometimes things were completely fake. People went away. People came, I guess I'll say they came with questions and they left with understanding that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So these were spaces where people were learning and gathering and producing knowledge. So this is the image of the Crystal Palace that I've had up here, and this gives us a sense of what it looks like on the inside. So you can see here there are different exhibition spaces for different nations. In some cases, there are spaces for particular types of industries or manufactured goods, so fabrics or I don't know, I don't know, any sort of thing that you could imagine, any sort of manufactured goods, there might be a space for those. So that's what the Crystal Palace looked like. But let's move ahead in time now to the World's Columbian Exposition, which is also popularly known as the Chicago World's Fair. So this was meant to commemorate Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1492. I don't know if it was planning was off or something. They didn't quite get the time right. So it happened in 1893. And it was held from May to October, so about 6 months. And unlike the Crystal Palace, there was actually an entire uh, basically a campus that was set up. Let's see, here's an image here. So it was almost a little village that was created with a lot of buildings. So it was a much bigger space. There were a lot of exhibits that were set up outside as well. So it's a much bigger enterprise. And a lot of what's on display at the Chicago World's Fair was technological advancements. So some really important inventions were debuted at the Chicago World's Fair. There were forms of electricity people hadn't seen before, and there were electric lights that really lit up the entire place. So this is one of the reasons why it was called the White City. There was this white spray painted plastered architecture, and then these bright electric lights that really lit everything up. The Ferris wheel was debuted at this fair. There was the first moving walkway, and there was an electric automobile. So a lot of interesting exhibits of technological advancements, a lot of manufactured goods. There was like, for example, like a leather house, a place where you could just go and look at different things made out of leather. There were stockyards, animals. There were plants that were displayed. So just this huge array of different types of objects were displayed. And then a lot of nations had their own pavilions that they could design however they wanted to. So there were 46 nations that had their own pavilions, and 34 states had their own spaces. And then there were also 4 territories that had pavilions as well. This gives us a sense of the huge amount of space that this fair took up. Uh, so that's kind of around, that's in the south side of Chicago. Uh, and I think now the Science and Industry Museum is one of the buildings that was made that was permanent, but most of these buildings were just meant to be temporary. And I have one more image there that gives us a sense of this grand scale of of the fairgrounds there. So there were all of these displays. There were also more the permanent displays that kind of lasted the length of the fair. And then there were temporary displays. There were also a lot of performances. So there were bands, orchestras, choirs, there were dancers. There was apparently a large electric organ, which was a new something new. People hadn't seen that before. Houdini performed at this fair. There was like a bodybuilding show. So a lot of really interesting, entertaining things that people could see. There was art that was displayed, painters and sculptors from throughout the United States and beyond. So it was just truly a spectacle. Here is an image of an inside of one of the pavilions there. So you could see there were recreations of towns and villages. And that's what some nations decided they wanted to do. And here we have Iowa's pavilion. I think that there was a corn house as well. So I need to look into that. So just all sorts of things. They just made a spectacle of it. So apparently there were some like animals constructed out of almonds and just the strangest things that you could see. So some of this, it kind of sounds like fun and interesting. There's definitely an insidious side to these fairs as well. So I'll show an image in a moment, but one of the really problematic things that was happening at these fairs were displays of people and kind of cultural groups. So we can think about fairs as really wanting to demonstrate national power and progress in advancements in technology and these sorts of things. And these are supposedly the hallmarks of civilized societies, civilized cultures and nations. And so there are a lot of displays at these fairs of indigenous communities. And these are communities that, in most regards, had been colonized by these powerful nations. And in a lot of cases, they were presented as primitive or uncivilized, kind of as foils against which the progress of European nations could be measured. So there's the phrase that some of you may have heard called human zoos. So there were, essentially people that were kind of set up in villages, and fairgoers would just walk by and kind of gawk at them. So there's this really unsettling thing happening where really people are being put on displaying. Sadia Qureshi discusses this in a book I have my students read called Peoples on Parade. It's something that starts out in England. So we see that happening at the Crystal Palace Expo. And all of this ends up carrying over to the world's Parliament of Religions as well. So let's talk about that now. So this is in a lot of ways known as an important event. It's the birth of the interfaith movement. A lot of people recognize it as very significant. Honestly, my job, my field probably wouldn't exist if this hadn't happened. But this Parliament is one of many congresses or conferences that occurred at World's Fairs. The idea was initially attributed to Charles Carroll Bonney. He was interested in having some sort of intercultural exchanges at the World's Fairs that really went beyond just displays of material triumphs. So he says that he wants to see something nobler and just more, more than just being able to see stuff. He wants people to have conversations. So he says, in connection with all that, with the important event of the world, all government, jurisprudence, finance, science, literature, education, and religion should be represented in a congress of all sorts of leaders, statesmen, educators, writers, and so forth. So he wanted to highlight the intellectual production of humankind, not just the material production of humankind. So initially, this idea was to have some conversations, to have some conferences, and there was one organizing committee, and then the idea really snowballed, and eventually there were a number of different committees that had to be formed in order to handle all of these different congresses that ended up developing. So there were 20 sort of general department congresses on different topics like religion, medicine, women's issues, different things like this. But there were actually 200 separate committees and 200 separate congresses or gatherings that occurred during this period. So the World's Parliament of Religion was only one of these many gatherings. There were actually 41 congresses under the category of religion that took place during the World's Fair. But really, the World's Parliament of Religion was the sort of main event. Somebody named Reverend John Henry Barrows was the chairman of this committee, and there was a larger organizing committee, and it was mostly Christian leaders and thinkers that were on this committee. There was one rabbi, and it was diverse in terms of a lot of different Christian groups were represented, but really the emphasis of this parliament ends up really being on Christianity, as we will see. So they sent thousands of invitations out around the globe to try to encourage folks from many religions to come to this event. They had a lot of positive responses, and some negative ones. And so eventually they were able to get this event, set up. They have support from the larger Chicago World's Fair, and they end up holding this event over the course of September of 1893. It's September 11th to September 27th. So actually, we're at the point where we're in the anniversary of this happening. So every day there were 3 sessions. They all lasted about 2.5 hours, and they were held at Columbus Hall in, what is now the Art Institute of Chicago here. And it is really noteworthy that there are a lot of religious leaders from around the world that come to this event and that speak to a broad public really for the first time. So there are a number of Buddhist speakers representing Zen, Theravada, and Pure Land Buddhism. What is arguably the first discussion of Baha'i faith in the United States. There are Confucian speakers, there are Hindu speakers, there are folks discussing Shinto and Jainism, Christian Science, and we have folks representing Judaism, Islam, the Theosophical movement, spiritualism, Catholicism, Judaism, and all sorts of different forms of Protestantism. So we have some folks who are primarily there to kind of represent their tradition and give some sort of overview, some main ideas from their tradition they're wanting to share with the public. We also have some talks that are focused more on philosophical issues. We have some individuals speaking about comparative religion or the academic study of religion, some folks talking about sacred texts, some talking about literature, some focusing on specific populations like women or children. And there is a kind of an echoing theme of universality that you hear that a lot of Christian speakers are talking about, but then some other non-Christian speakers are also discussing. So here, to kind of give us a sense of the way that this is being framed, this is an excerpt from this 1891 invitation that was sent out to folks to encourage them to participate in this religion. And we can kind of see from looking at it that it's, really thinking about universality, but from a kind of a Christian standpoint. So it reads, believing that God is, and that he has not left himself without witness, believing that the influence of religion tends to advance the general welfare and is the most vital force in the social order of every people, and convinced that of a truth God is no respecter of persons, but that in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted of him. We affectionately invite the representatives of all faiths to aid us in presenting to the world at the exposition in 1893 the religious harmonies and unities of humanity, and also in showing forth the moral and spiritual agencies which are at the root of human progress. So there's an effort on the part of the organizers to really try to think about the similarities and points that people can kind of come together and agree upon when they're thinking about religion. Here is a picture from the Parliament itself. We can see really a vast array of folks that were part of it. So it was held in Columbus Hall. The hall could really accommodate about 3,000 people, but reports indicate that in a lot of cases, the room is really overflowing. In some cases, there's as many as 5,000 people that are reported to have been at some of these talks. So they were quite popular, and it seems like probably the most popular of all of the congresses that happened. So as I mentioned, we are kind of at the anniversary of this event. So this would have been the 14th day. So 131 years ago, this was the 14th day of the Parliament. So if we had been there on this day in 1893, this is what we would have heard. We would have heard a talk on the relation of Christianity to America by Reverend Thomas Gordon from the Catholic University of America. We would have heard the talk, What Religion Hath Wrought for America? We would have heard a talk called The Present Condition of America by another reverend. We would have heard a talk called The Invincible Gospel by a reverend from London. So so it seems like this day is kind of like religion in America, sort of Christianity in America sort of day. That was the theme of the day. But this last paper is interesting because it really tried to argue for Christianity being the superior religion, the ultimate triumph of Christianity as assured by its essential spirit's superiority to all other religions. So even though there was an effort to try um, to incorporate a lot of different faiths and a lot of different traditions, you ended up having a number of presenters who really just wanted to argue for the superiority of their own tradition. And in some cases, there are reports of people kind of being demeaning to other non-Christian religions who are there. The people, they sent out these invitations. Obviously, this was very popular. There was a lot of positive response to it, but there were also some folks who were not happy with the idea and that were kind of detractors. So one fun anecdote I found is that some people just said it was kind of boring, and one account indicates that there were some quote dreary stretches of the commonplace, which I think is a lovely way to say that something is boring. But there were also some kind of interesting concerns about this event on the part of some religious leaders. So there were invitations sent out to a lot of folks, and some people wrote back and basically said, I don't think that this is a good idea, that we should be meeting. My tradition, whatever it is, my tradition is superior. And, I refuse to consider, attending this event where a lot of people are going to be speaking together. I think that it's a bad idea. There were some folks who are Christian who said that it was going to be potentially morally dangerous because the organizers would be, quote, inviting heathens to America, and that would somehow challenge Christianity or challenge people's morals or values or something like that. But it's interesting because, there's some folks who didn't want to participate because they believed that Christianity was superior, and that there were also some folks who participated and just basically while they were there just talked about how Christianity was superior. So there was just a really, wide array of talks, and also some fights, some arguments. Apparently, there was one Christian leader, for example, who accused Hindu priestesses of being prostitutes, which is terrible. But later, they had a chance. These speakers had a chance to really speak up for their tradition and had a platform to really push back and resist some of these racist depictions of their tradition, and speak for themselves in the way that this platform provided a space for. So there are accounts of of heated arguments breaking out during this event. There were also some really important and incredible and critical responses to this event. Maybe we'll come back to this in a little bit, but here, this is an image of some of the leaders. So in the center here is Swami Vivekananda, who gave a discussion on Hinduism that was wildly popular, and it enabled him to actually travel and speak throughout the United States after this event. But this is really the first chance for folks from the United States to hear speakers talk about traditions, from their own perspectives. Um, and I think that is something that I think was a valuable takeaway from the event. In some cases, though, we have examples of folks kind of being presented as exotic or kind of being essentialized in some ways. And so there also is that the danger of that happening at this event, of somehow a kind of a form of Oriental gaze, really presenting people from other nations as kind of exotic or somehow different. Um, but I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the representations of Indigenous traditions. So this is one of the communities that I focus on, one of the issues that I focus on. And one of the noteworthy things about the World's Parliament of Religion is that there were actually no Native American speakers who were present. And this is the case because at this point in time, there really was not the widespread belief that Indigenous religions were legitimate religions. So there is Native American representation at this event, but it's kind of rare that people are able to speak for themselves. So in a lot of cases, Native peoples are represented at the fair as like cultures under the domain of anthropology. So I'd mentioned that that this specific World's Fair at Chicago, 1893, is important for the development of U.S. anthropology. So there are a couple of main anthropology displays. There is one that was created by folks associated with the Smithsonian, and that was held in the Federal Building. And then there was another anthropology house that was created by Frederick Putnam. He was the director of Harvard's Peabody Museum. So he had his own building that he was working with. And so you have these efforts on the part of anthropologists to represent Native cultures. And one interesting development we see is that up to this point, in a lot of cases in museums, there is kind of a comparative way of displaying Native objects where kind of all objects of a specific type would have been displayed in the same case. So you would have a case of a variety of baskets, a case containing spears, a case containing arrowheads. So it was kind of, just presenting people as, kind of all being the same. So that's one of the things that does is kind of flattens all Native cultures into, I don't know, one supposed, form of culture. And at that time, they would have labeled these like savage or primitive cultures. But there is an effort on the part of some of the anthropologists to try to present Native cultures in a different way. So we see the development of this form of life group exhibition. And so what they're doing in some of these anthropological displays is kind of trying to put together almost like a diorama of putting, putting objects from one community together kind of in this scene. They had mannequins where they would put, clothing associated with this particular group on them and kind of set them up as if they were doing something. So that's a new advancement that we see that emerges at this World's Fair. You see a few different villages. There's a recreation of cliff dwellings from the American Southwest. And there are some examples of Native American content in some of the state pavilions. Buffalo Bill wanted to come and be a part of this, and they didn't let him. And so he set up his show, his Wild West show, just like right outside the Chicago World's Fair. So there are some Native folks who are, participating in that. There's also an Indian fair, or excuse me, an Indian school that's set up. So I have a few images I'll show you here. There actually is one speaker at the World's Parliament of Religion who talks about the religion of Native North Americans, but she's doing so, as an anthropologist. So she's spent time studying and working with Native peoples, but, they're not able to really represent themselves in the parliament. So you end up seeing kind of things like this. Like this is an example of some of the different little um, recreations. There we see there's a Javanese village. Um, and here is an image of like teepees that are set up. And so this is what I was saying about the human zoos. Um, this is really orchestrated by other folks. This is not necessarily the way that people are wanting to represent themselves. This is taken from the Indian school exhibit, and this is a very really problematic thing that's happening at this point in time. So one of the goals of the assimilation era was to try to train Native American children to be more like, Euro-American citizens. And one of the ways that they did this was through Indian boarding schools. I think that there's more just general knowledge about them nowadays, but these were really damaging to Native children who had to go, were not able to speak their native languages, were kind of removed from their cultures, removed from the ceremonial cycle of their communities. But there was, this basically was set up to show evidence of progress of the US government succeeding in basically converting Native kids to Christianity and really ultimately the goal is to really eliminate Native cultures. So you see this at the Chicago World's Fair. But I do want to note that throughout, all of these kind of more dubious things that are happening, there are folks who are speaking up and speaking out against some of the representations that they're seeing. So one really important example of this is a speech that was given by Simon Pickagon, who's Potawatomi. So his homelands are from the Chicago area. And he's an important leader of his community. And he's invited to speak at the Chicago World's Fair, not at the World's Parliament of Religions, because his traditions would not have been considered legitimate traditions by a lot of folks who are there. But he's invited to speak, and he uses this opportunity to speak before a huge crowd and really call out some of the inconsistencies and hypocrisies that he sees happening at the Chicago World's Fair. His speech was later published as the Red Man's Greeting. Sometimes it's also called the Red Man's Rebuke. And I wanted to just share a little bit of this so you could get a sense of this really, the tone that he takes. So he says, "In behalf of my people, the American Indians, I hereby declare to you, the pale-faced race that has usurped our lands and homes, that we have no spirit to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair now being held in the Chicago city, the wonder of the world. No sooner would we hold high joy day over the graves of our departed fathers than to celebrate our own funeral, the discovery of America. And while you who are strangers and you who live here bring the offerings of the handiwork of your own lands, and your hearts in admiration rejoice over the beauty and grandeur of this young republic, and you say, 'Behold the wonders wrought by our children in this foreign land,' do not forget that this success has been at the sacrifice of our homes and a once happy race." That was his opening. So he opened his speech with this. And some accounts I've read suggest that there were up to maybe 70,000 people who were present. And in any case, it was a large number of folks gathered to hear this talk. And he really doesn't let up. The very end of this talk, he ends up almost calling upon God to almost curse the folks who are participating in this destruction of Native American life and history. So, while there are really a lot of problematic displays of Native peoples at the Chicago World's Fair, and the complete absence of people representing their own traditions at the World's Parliament of Religion, there is a space for folks like Simon Pickagon and some other speakers to push back against some of these grand representations. So I guess I'll wrap things up here, and then I can answer questions if anybody has any. Because one of the things that I have been thinking about is, what is this religiously pluralistic? To what extent was this actually this World Parliament of Religion actually an example of religious pluralism? And if I think that as my students hate it when I tell them this, but there's not a simple answer. It's a really complex, it's a complex event. And I would say in a lot of cases, the loudest voices are the ones that are Protestant and that really want to advocate for an idea of universal religion that is Protestant Christianity. But at the same time, as I was indicating, it creates this space for folks from different traditions to really speak up, to push back, to describe their traditions, in the way that they want to present themselves to others, to really share a lot about their cultures and traditions that people living in the United States just had not heard about before. So I think ultimately, I think it was really important as a place for dialogue and discourse and argumentation, even if perhaps it didn't live up to its goal of being, entirely pluralistic. I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks so much for listening, and I would welcome any questions you might have.
And I posted a couple of links to some of the books that she referenced, but I
Yeah.
think you've got a reference page there for
Yes, I do.
us.
Yeah, let me put that up there.
And I'm going to post the link to the survey. If you would just take a brief second to fill that out, we do read them. But let's open it up for questions for Sarah. You can unmute yourself and ask directly. Oh, everyone's shy, Sarah.
Maybe there's one more slide that I realized I could maybe mention just because some folks might be interested. But another example of somebody really pushing back against this was against what was happening at the Chicago World's Fair was Frederick Douglass. So he also really questioned if this, World's Columbian Exposition was, fully living up to American ideals. So that's kind of another interesting anecdote from the Chicago World's Fair.
And did we see anything of this scale in a religious tenor at a different World's Fair, or was this kind of a one and done?
This was so the World's Parliament of Religion ends up continuing on. It's not always regularly, so it's not like it was held. I can't remember when the next one was held, but so they actually do still continue to this day. One thing I've never been, so I would love to go at some point. But one thing that I did read was that it wasn't until 1993 that you saw more representation from Indigenous traditions. So it really took that long for some of these, traditions to be really more respected and considered to be, worthy of you know, discussion or worthy of being there. Um, so prior to this, and from what I understand at the Crystal Palace Expo, it sounds like there were missionaries that were there that were like distributing Bibles, but there wasn't the same sort of gathering or meeting, beforehand. Um, yeah, so it was a pretty unique event when it was first held.
Uh,
Sarah, this is your Aunt Kathy from Lawrence. Hi. And I noticed the group photo of the religious leaders. Were there any women at
Oh,
all involved in speaking?
yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much for asking. That's something that I should have mentioned, but I think that there were 17 women that presented at some point during the World's Parliament of Religion. There were some discussions about like women's roles in religion. So that's something that there was an effort to include women's perspectives. There actually was also a women's building at the Chicago World's Fair itself, which was completely designed by women. It was, all of the things that were like the objects that were displayed there were things that women had made. So there is more of an effort to include women's perspectives. Yeah.
Thank you.
Trevor, did you have a question?
Say.
Yeah, Sarah, I wanted to ask, um, I know like in contemporary times, like scholars like Wendy Brown talk about how we use tolerance to manage like religious
Mhm.
difference.
Yeah.
Could this have been like the idea of pluralism in like the World's Fair been an earlier example of like American religious officials, like you said, predominantly popular, I would guess, well-known Protestant theologians and ministers in the US using this as like an example of a moment to like control um, the rise of religious like difference in America.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think I mean, so because the folks that are in charge are really creating the narrative and they're creating the framework for, people to even be included. So I think that, yeah, like I was saying, I think that it kind of it looks like maybe in some ways it could be benevolent to try to, encourage all these folks to come and participate. But I do think that's one of the things you can read into it is that there is an effort to really maintain, one particular vision of religion, of like one true or pure religion. Um, but I don't, I like I was saying, I think that in some cases participants had other ideas. And so, like it or not, um, they did end up, yeah, like creating this space for folks to get get their own perspectives out there. But I do see it ultimately as a way to try to advance specific goals of Protestant Christianity.
Thank you.
It's complicated. Yeah. Yeah.
Will you put up your resources
Oh,
and
yes,
sources
of course.
page,
Yeah.
please?
Mhm.
Just for those that are,
Yeah.
there we go.
Sarah, I'm curious about, you mentioned that the only presentation on Native American religions was someone who was an anthropologist who was speaking for Native
Mhm.
Americans and kind of about, and I'm wondering about the extent to which that happened with other religious traditions. Is there a situation where there are like
Yeah.
Buddhist
So
priests presenting about Buddhism and also anthropologists presenting about Buddhism?
yeah, that is the case. And so you kind of have examples of each. And I'm trying to think, some of the early folks who are going out and engaging in anthropological research on different communities are missionaries. Some early museums are created by missionaries. And so I'm trying to think of specific examples, but I think for example, like you have some folks who are Buddhist leaders who are talking, but then I think you also have some people who are not Buddhist who are speaking on their behalf. So it's kind of an interesting mix of a few different um, formats, I guess, for these types of talks. Of course, there's nobody who's offering an outsider's perspective of Christianity or, in the talks themselves, although there is conversation about that, there's pushback. But yeah, so there's a variety of types of talks. Mhm.
And that was Emily Morgan. We'll plug her program coming up here. Not to take away from Sarah's thunder, but Emily's going to do a program on eating at the World's Fair. So like the complete opposite of religion. But eating can be a religion. And that's October 15th. And she'll be doing that online via Zoom at 5 p.m. Central Time.
Awesome.
And any more questions? We have time for maybe one or two more. Otherwise, I'm going to call Aunt Kathy back. Well, I think that's it, Sarah. We do thank you. And again, the references are up there and I put a few in the chat. If you wouldn't mind filling out that survey for us, that would be great. And we will hopefully get a chance to visit the World's Fair exhibition before it closes at the end of October. And kudos to Sarah for bringing the whole concept, which she didn't even realize, of the World's Fair exhibition to the farmhouse. So credit to her. And thank you for tonight's presentation. It was very informative. It has been recorded, just so you all know. I don't know how widely we will distribute it because it is Sarah's intellectual knowledge. And so if you do want a copy of it, though, maybe just pop an email to our museums and we will hopefully can give you some access there. Again, a big round of applause for Sarah and kudos. And again, try to visit us and see that exhibition before it closes at the end of October. Thank you, everyone.